Welcome. I am Austin Yenne. I am a member of the Palm Beach Young Democrats and the lead contributor to the group's blog. This is the first in a series of recorded interviews. Continuing our series of interviews, our latest guest is Florida Politico writer Marc Caputo. Marc Caputo is one of Florida's top political reporters who is kind enough to take time out of his busy schedule to share some very interesting insights into his work. This is a recording of our interview. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Start with your history. So, have you always lived in Florida?
Not always, but I grew up here.
Okay, so you were born in Florida. I guess I should rephrase that.
No, I was not born in Florida. I was born overseas, actually. My dad was a foreign correspondent with the Chicago Tribune, and I was coincidentally born in Rome, where he was based.
Oh, okay. When did you move into Florida?
You know, I think by the time I was in preschool, 4 or 5.
What made you want to get into reporting? Did you always want to be a reporter, or?
Not particularly, no. My dad was a reporter before me, but when I grew up, by then he became a writer or a novelist. So I didn't observe him as a reporter per se. But I graduated from college with no useful degree, a general studies degree, and no real marketable skills. So I wound up going home kind of jobless. And because I was able to write and I was interested in literature, I was waiting to get a fellowship to get a master's in literature. And I started working, freelancing for this weekly publication in Key West called Solaris Hill newspaper. I began doing that stuff and helped write a walking guide to Key West, which is where I grew up. And then the Key West Citizen was hiring, so I wound up working there covering crime. And then I liked it, and I had a certain proficiency for the work, albeit it wasn't particularly high paying, but I liked it. And so I stayed with it. And so I went from the Key West Citizen to the Naples Daily News. I then went over to Arizona to the Tribune newspapers in the East Valley of Phoenix, based in Mesa. And then I came back to cover county government for the Palm Beach Post. And then got hired at the Miami Herald to cover the state capitol, Tallahassee, and worked there for a number of years. And then the Herald made me political writer eventually and moved me down to Miami. And so I worked at the Herald for 2003 to 2015, right? 2003. So what was that?
About 12 years.
12 years. Yeah. So I worked at the Herald for about 12 years. And then when Politico began their state expansion, I'd been talking to them, and so I began working for Politico in February of 2015.
So you've been working for Politico for about 3 years now, just a little over?
That's about right, yeah.
So, did they always just assign you on state work, or is that just something that you decided to just stay with instead of moving over to federal work?
Well, I've had an opportunity. I've had various job offers to go to Washington, but I'm married. My wife is a school teacher, a public school teacher. She is originally from Massachusetts, and she doesn't want to move up north. And if you grow up in Florida, or if you're in Florida, Washington is up north.
Yeah, that is very true.
So here we are. I've got three kids. We're pretty. My two littlest ones were very little when we first moved to Miami, and they've now kind of grown up here for a number of years. And I live near some friends who have girls who are about my girl's age, and there's certainly certain family concerns as well. So here I am. Plus, my mom still lives in Key West, as does a dear friend of mine who's older and his health isn't so good. And so we stay close to them for that reason as well.
Was that the friend that you spent the time with during the hurricane?
Yeah, David Wright. He's a maritime artist, Key West maritime art, and an interior designer. And he's got he's in failing health. I'm glad he's still alive, but actually he's back up here and he's back in hospital as we speak.
Oh, sorry to hear that. So what was your first big story for the Miami Herald? What would you classify as your first big break for the Herald?
I wouldn't say first big break. I mean, my most memorable coverage was during that period of 2000 2004 and 2005, and we had like 8 hurricanes damage the state in a span of about 13 months. Because I was based in Tallahassee at the time, and under the Herald's old structure, I used to basically cover any storms that would kind of hit north of Orlando anyway. And at the time, I still owned a house in West Palm Beach while living in Tallahassee. I was renting it out, so I would actually come down to check on my house for the hurricanes. So, just as far as like a big story, being in New Orleans, seeing Katrina get destroyed, or better part of seeing Katrina destroy New Orleans, moving over to the Gulf Coast and seeing the devastation there, it's kind of eye-opening that how tenuous existence is, especially a world without power becomes pretty savage pretty quickly. Politically speaking, the Martin Lee Anderson case might have been perhaps the most intense as far as kind of a crush of daily coverage. Martin Lee Anderson was a 14-year-old boy. I think he was 14, almost positive. He stole his grandmother's car. He got put in a DJJ lockup, a boot camp in Panama City, and he died after he was beaten by guards. And it was pretty sensational. But this is the era kind of really before YouTube, before Twitter, before Facebook. And the attention that was kind of lavished on Trayvon Martin, lavish might be the wrong verb, but, the attention that was paid to Trayvon Martin probably would have been paid as much to Martin Anderson's case had it happened, later, had social media been back then. But, we did a number of stories. I worked with my colleagues. I didn't break them all. But, we found that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement chief at the time, Guy Cannell, he'd been the former sheriff of Bay County, where the boot camp was. He was supposed to be investigating the sheriff who ran the boot camp that he had founded. My colleague, Carol Marvin Miller, got emails showing that basically FDLE wasn't going to take the investigation seriously. The whole thing probably would have been really swept under the rug, but we gave it quite a bit of attention. Now, the guards involved in the beating were all acquitted at trial, but they were charged, which I wonder if they would have been in the first place. And the family was recompensed by the Florida legislature. I believe Charlie Crist would have been governor at the time. It either would have been Crist's first year as governor or Jebb's last year as governor, or the beating might have happened in 2006, the death, like January of 2006, and then in the spring of 2007, the family might have been recompensed. So, it was an opportunity to kind of blend both politics, policy, and disaster as a reporter, and it was kind of pretty memorable. And nowadays, when you see the Black Lives Matter movement and you see more and more evidence of police brutality and the struggles that marginalized communities have with law enforcement, it was really instructive to have had that experience many years ago. Yeah, in fact, if you go to YouTube and you look Martin Lee Anderson, you can see the videotape of him being kind of swarmed and like kind of kneed and put in kind of jiu-jitsu-like arm locks or pressure point techniques are used on him. And there's one point where they pick up his limp body. I mean, they should have known to get that kid to a hospital at that point. And the way they're holding him with his arms out, and he's dressed in all white, and it's kind of a grainy footage. He has kind of almost a Christ-like pose, like someone on a cross. And it's pretty shocking. And it's just I don't know the guards who did this. I don't presume to know what was in their minds at the time. But, if you're in a situation where you're always where you're entrusted with lots of power, especially over kids, you're allowed to use violence, you're allowed to use physical force, you can kind of paradoxically become much more animal about things and less human. And I think what really strikes me about watching that tape is like there was like a human part of their brains that were shut off. And it was far more kind of animal to watch them kind of swarm this kid. And just kind of no one seemed to really realize, like, holy shit, this kid's limp. Like, let's get him out of the sun. Let's get him instant medical care. Now, there was a nurse there, but, this is not the kind of field nurse you would want out, with you if something went wrong. Anyway, the kid wound up dying. It was kind of an outrage because the cause of death was determined to be sickle cell trait, despite the beating the kid had gotten. Maybe that's true. I'm not a medical examiner or physician, don't pretend to be, but I do wonder if rather than being kneed and administered smelling salts when he passed out, kind of beaten a little more and manhandled, if they would have gotten him to a hospital, that even if it were sickle cell trait, that he actually would have lived instead of dying. I just can't see how the shock to that system would not have contributed to his death.
How does a reporter in general go about getting sources without?
Oh, just kind of just the more you do, the more you get, right? So, I've been a reporter in the state for a number of years now. I used to be based in Tallahassee, and a lot of people know me, and I have, for lack of a better term, a certain brand. There are a limited number of political reporters anyway. So, when there are certain political stories, there are various people who are going to go to various reporters. And, it's I guess maybe it's a mystery explaining. I haven't really thought about it that much. But generally, the more you write about something, the more people want to talk to you about what you're writing about and influence that, shape that, talk to you about it. And, it's one of those things that, it kind of feeds on itself. As I said, the more you do, the more you get. The more you produce, the more people want to be part of the conversation that you happen to be covering.
So I want to actually kind of expand on that a little bit. So I imagine you're going to have people from different political camps come give you stories. Now, is that a bit of a quid pro quo? Does that ever come across?
That doesn't happen. The answer to your question in sum is no. Like, I've never been told, hey, cover this, but I'm giving you this, but in return for you doing this, you can't do the other thing. If something's news, it's news. Now, there are some people you have a closer relationship with, and when you have to write something difficult about them, it's both harder and easier. That is, like, and I've had to do it a number of times. So you talk to people like, look, basically, hey, I'm sorry I have to do this, but we've got this story, and doesn't reflect well on you, and so I'm gonna, I've got to write it. This is my job, and I'm going to be as upfront and honest with you as possible, and be as fair with you as I can. And people generally appreciate that. Now, there are times when people adopt a far more hostile attitude and don't want to share any information with you, which sometimes makes it easier to write about them, especially if they're in a situation like, say, Jack Latvala was. So, there are times when you're writing things that are tough about people, where it's tougher to write, and there are times when you're writing things that are tough about people when it's easier to write.
So I actually do want to talk about Jack Lavala's story. So that was a huge. That shocked everything over in Tallahassee. Once that started, it especially with everything with the Me Too movement, it looked like a bunch more sexual harassment stuff came out. How did that end up in your lap? Did someone come to you directly, or?
Well, no. Actually, our new reporter Alex Glorioso had, when she came to Tallahassee, she was kind of shocked by how old boy networky it was, and how, and kind of the atmosphere of, I wouldn't say sexual harassment, but for loss of a better term, the atmosphere of the patriarchy. This is the town run by white guys, old white guys. There's lots of pretty girls running around, in revealing clothes and pretty smelling perfume. So she got to talking to one of these women, and one of these women had said this to her. And then we just kind of moved forward with that information over time. So it was myself, it was Alex Glorioso, or Alexandra, and Matt Dixon.
Okay.
And these are stories like that, big stories like that, just like I told you earlier about the Martin Lee Anderson case.
Yeah.
Those are things you kind of cover every day. there's usually a new development every day, and you write about it every day, and you really kind of go into overdrive. And it's also one of those things that, again, the more you do, the more people come forward.
So it would be fair to say that Alex basically had gotten to the start of this story. And then,
yeah, I think if it wasn't for Alex, I can't say it wouldn't have happened because I don't know, but because of Alex, it happened.
All right, so you've been covering politics for, what, roughly at least 12 years of your career?
Yeah, well, my first statewide race was the 2002 governor's race between Jeb Bush and Bill McBride.
Okay. I kind of want to move over into the governor's race area. So, Florida is known nationally as a purple state, a swing state for national races. But, statewide, it's been, Republican for at least 20 years. Well, our last governor was actually Gwen Graham's dad.
Actually, technically, no.
Oh.
The last governor is actually Buddy McKay. It would have been Lawton Chiles, but Lawton Chiles died right before he was termed out of office. So Buddy McKay, who was the lieutenant governor, was briefly the governor for like a month or two. Yeah. So Chiles beat Jeb in Jeb's first race in '94. So Jeb challenged Chiles in '94 in Chiles' second race, and Jeb, lost, albeit rather narrowly. And then in '98, he won rather handily against McKay. And then in 2002, he won handily as well against McBride.
What I want to get to is that why do you think on a state level Democrats continually fail to get into office if they technically hold the more, registered votes?
Right. Well, the more registered votes is a little deceiving because, especially in the past, now not as much, but still to a degree, there are a fair share of Democrats who are North Florida Democrats, old Dixiecrats who vote Republican. That is changing, but it's not completely changed yet. But still, generally speaking, yes, Democrats outnumber Republicans. But the two parties' relative strengths and their relative weaknesses are comparable, or better said, each party's strength is also its weakness. So the strength of the Republican Party is it's basically an all-white, older party. And I said basically, it's not all white. Yes, there are, I think 7-8% black, and yes, there's a fair share of Cuban Americans, especially in Miami-Dade. But when you look at things on kind of a cultural basis, when you have one party that is so kind of monolithic in the people who comprise its background, white Christians, and generally older, it's easier to kind of move them as one. Whereas the Democratic coalition, its strength is that it's bigger. It's white and non-white. But the problem with that is that you have all of these kind of different camps. And when you look at voter performance, the number one signifier of voter turnout is age. The older people are, the more likely they are to vote. And when you look at things on a racial basis, the people most likely to vote are white. The party of the older white people has kind of an inherent advantage because their voters are more kind of culturally attuned to voting more. They just do. And what you see in election after election, and what we have seen in election after election, is the Democratic base, young people, non-white voters, they drop off rather significantly in these midterm elections. And year after year after year after year, it's been kind of the same old song. Now, there are some people who argue we just haven't had a true progressive on the ticket. If we did, the Democrats would come out to vote. Okay, well, maybe we're going to see it this time. I think arguably Andrew Gillum has done the best job occupying that space. But, the reality is that by and large, relative to Republicans, the Democratic base is just less likely to turn out. And it's been shown time and again.
So that's the biggest problem, is that they don't show up to vote. So.
Yeah, if you look at the advantage of Florida is that we keep pretty good records on voters, on race, age, party affiliation. You can see the drop-off. Now, don't quote these numbers exactly, but So like in 2008 and 2012, more Democrats in total numbers showed up at the polls than registered Republicans. And Democrats won. And in the midterms, before and after, fewer Democrats showed up at the polls than Republicans, and Republicans won.
So the Democrats are showing up for the big federal election, so the presidential election basically is what you're saying, and then when the midterms come, they forget, or for whatever reason.
They forget, or they're not being reached. They're not as aware of like how important it is. In fact, in some respects, how it's almost more important to have a governor than a president. State legislatures do things, like lots of things. And governors do things, lots of things, especially relative to the president. But that message is abided by much more with Republicans and Republican-leaning voters than Democrats.
It's interesting to know.
One of the real puzzling problems for Democrats is Hispanic voters have the worst turnout rate by race and ethnicity. The best turnout rate is among whites. The second best is among blacks. And the worst is among Hispanics. In fact, if you take out Cubans, who actually have a turnout rate that's comparable to, if not higher, than non-Hispanic whites, Hispanic turnout rate is even worse. Puerto Rican turnout, especially like in Osceola County, in Orange County, the Hispanic turnout in those counties has plummeted in the past few midterms. Will it in this midterm? Well, we're going to see.
So we obviously have a big governor's race going on now. And the two big candidates we got are Adam Putnam and Ron DeSantis. So you got those, on the Republican side, and then you've got Gwen Graham, you've got Andrew Gillum, Chris King, and Philip Levine, obviously running on the Democratic ticket. So what are your thoughts on that? Who do you think is going to come out of the Republican primary, let alone the Democratic primary, as victors?
I don't know.
Is it too early to make a guess?
Well, it's probably too early. You could say right now, like kind of an elite conservative opinion for a period of time really thought that DeSantis was going to come up and steal it, but he hasn't yet. And so there's more of a shift in believing that Putnam is going to be the nominee for the Republicans. The Democratic race is harder to predict, but still most elite opinion seems to favor Gwen Graham, even though she's not in front in some polls now because Levine is spending so much money on TV. We're in the kind of the Trump era. There's a lot of energy and enthusiasm and anger among a lot of women. And, Gwen Graham is the only woman running for governor. And I can see her losing, but the reason I think she's favored at the moment is there is a belief among a significant portion of the electorate. Remember, women are like 55% of the electorate. I don't know what they are by registered Democrats. That it's time to have a woman in charge. And so, Graham might be at the perfect intersection for that. Now, there are some knocks on her and on the way her campaign is running, and campaigns matter, but atmosphere matters as well. Both races are still wide open. Now, who's favored now is not necessarily who's going to win or who's going to be favored later.
The always statement, and I'm going to do a poor analogy here, is that you always say, well, you're in Washington, so you don't know what's going on in the state. So I'm going to go ahead and say, you're up in Tallahassee, so do you think Miami being as far south in Florida, do you think it gets neglected more often because of how, the distance, even though they have representatives?
Oh yeah, well there's a persistent anti-South Florida bias, and especially anti-media bias in the state legislature. It's partly probably racially based, it's partly politically based, and it's also partly understandable. Like reality is Miami's it's like a den of thieves. We have one of the highest Medicare and Medicaid fraud rates in the nation. We have one of the highest rates of suspicious real estate transactions. We have one of the highest rates of automobile insurance fraud. We have one of the highest rates of questionable homeowner insurance claims through something called assignment of benefits. So it's not. While yes, some of some of the bias against Miami and Tallahassee is probably racially, ethnically, and culturally based. There's also some foundation for thinking if we send lots of money down to Miami, it's going to get all sucked up and stolen, because very often it does.
So, actually, I want to talk a little bit about national now. So, obviously, we have our Democratic Senator Bill Nelson and now our Republican governor running for Senate. And you've written a lot about that. I think you're covering this as well?
Yep.
So, it looks like Rick Scott's got plenty of money to spend, which obviously is not surprising, and Bill Nelson's looks like he's going slow out the gate.
Right.
So, at least as far as past history can tell, that Scott has spent a lot of money on his races, but he's won by, both his governorships by about 1 point, if I'm not mistaken?
I think 1.2 and 1 point respectively, certainly less than 1.5 points for both. He's never gotten 50% of the vote or more.
Do you think that would reflect over onto a Senate race? Just an educated guess, or?
I mean, it could. I mean, the reality is he's won ugly in the past. In the past is prologue, he's going to win ugly again. Unlike those two previous races, though, Scott now has a record as governor, which he can point to and make the case that things are better now than they were 8 years ago. In fact, they are better now than they were 8 years ago for a lot of people. The economy's a lot better and the like. So, and his favorability ratings are higher now than they were in the past. More people like him than dislike him. More people approve of the job he's doing than disapprove of the job he's doing. So he's cured those problems he had in prior years. But then there's the atmospheric question. Is generally, in a midterm, the party of the president in power is punished at the polls. And so in 2014, when Scott ran for re-election, and in 2010, when Scott first ran for election, those were midterm Obama years. The mood was decidedly anti-Democrat and pro-Republican. Right now, the mood looks reversed. It looks more pro-Democrat and more anti-Republican. So, there are all of these different factors that start to come into play that make this race really complicated. You can't say, in the past, Bill Nelson's whipped his opponents, he's going to whip Rick Scott. You can't say in the past, Rick Scott's,
won ugly.
Won ugly, and therefore he's going to win ugly again. I don't know. And, in big top-of-the-ticket contested races, all of them have been decided by, 1.5, 2 points or fewer in the past, 4 or 5 cycles. So, in fact, I think Obama's 2008 election is the last time you saw a top-of-the-ticket candidate get, win by, 3 points or more. In the following, in the midterm, again, you had Rick Scott. He did not win handily. I guess let's use 2010. I think Rubio didn't win handily either, although that was a complicated race. 2014, the same thing. The 2012 election, Obama did not repeat his big margin of victory, so to speak. And then in the last election, Trump won by 1.5 points or so. We generally have close elections, and there's nothing in any of the data or my range of experience that suggests to me that we're not going to have a close election again. We're going to have maybe we won't, but I think it's a safe bet to say it's going to be a close race. And this really could be, I'm banking on this being a coin toss election. So,
why do you think Jeb and Rubio just flat out got wiped out in Florida by Trump, of all people?
Trump spoke deeply to a lot of Republicans, a lot of conservatives, and a lot of white. There was while his speech is simple, and they've done analyses of this, the messages he conveyed were kind of complex. A person of European descent is just like a lot of people, let's say, like a lot of African Americans, when they see an African American candidate, a lot of Hispanics, when they see a Hispanic candidate, or Puerto Ricans see a Puerto Rican candidate, or Cubans see a Cuban candidate, there is this kind of cultural affinity. And how do I phrase this properly? There's more of an understanding. And, Trump really spoke on a very cultural, basal level to a lot of white people. And there was a lot of hunger for what he did. I think there's some racial motivations for some people. But I disagree with a lot of liberal critics who basically say the Trump phenomenon was due to racism and racism alone, or racism primarily. I don't believe that. He was someone, especially in a state like Florida, but more broadly in a presidential race. These are marketing campaigns, right? And one of the things about marketing is you have to have a familiar brand. And Trump had been in people's living rooms and had been marketed by fucking NBC for a decade as the deal maker. Trump used to appear on rap albums. He's on Method Man's second rap album. He is, and when he ran, he was a
culture phenomenon.
Yeah, he's a cultural iconic figure. And so, now don't get me wrong, I didn't think he was. I was in denial about how popular he was. When I think once he hit like the 10th poll in Florida or the 5th poll in Florida, showing him just decimating everyone, I was like, holy shit, this is real. Like, this is something.
Have you been covering Parkland events?
No, not really, no. I mean, I covered some of the political aspects of it, but by and large, that's kind of a straight-up disaster story.
Yeah, what is the deal with that? The county's not releasing security footage or something?
Oh, that'd be a better question for the Herald. The Mighty Herald and I think the Sun Sentinel are suing to gain access to some of the video footage from that day. And the state attorney's office, the sheriff's office are not giving it up. Maybe the school board as well. I'm more of an open records kind of person. I don't think the news media should be showing, and I don't think the news media intends to show, the video of kids being shot to death. But I generally find that the government uses public records exemptions not to protect the public, but to protect the government. And I see it just time and time and time and time again. You especially see it in the juvenile justice system and in the school system. They claim, we're doing this to protect the children. Like, no, bullshit. You're doing this to protect the adults who are in charge, who sometimes were derelict in their duties, and that led to a tragedy or a trouble.
Speaking of that, because you live down in Miami, and I know you've talked about this a lot, about your wife's experience with the violence over in the neighborhoods while she deals with that at school. What do you think is a solution there? Is it an unemployment issue where people don't have jobs, so they fall into these categories? And
I don't know what the solution is. I think it's probably a bit of every. So once a child is born into a cycle of poverty, it's difficult for him to get out. And so how do you break that cycle of poverty? How do you create programs, both government programs, private programs, and public-private partnerships that help people get out of poverty, that help people get the education they need? I mean, I would love to have a few, I'd love to have $20 million or so to experiment, like in that neighborhood, to see if you could have just the right amount of services and just enough financial aid so that people can get on their feet and not constantly be behind, and have and I'm a big believer in small class sizes, and have small enough class sizes to provide enough individual education in 30 years, because that's probably how long it would take. Will that make a difference?
What are your thoughts what's going on over in Puerto Rico? Obviously they're still struggling to get power after almost 8 months, is it now, since it's been a hurricane? Since the hurricane knocked it all over?
Yeah, you can do the. I don't know what the math is or the counter is, but yeah, it's treated like a colony and it's run like a colony. It's treated like a colony, and now it looks like a colony. This is a legacy of bad governance in Puerto Rico, legacy of terrible colonialism for the United States, and I mean, my friends who spend more time in Puerto Rico than I do all tell me, and I think some of the reporting indicates, the federal response to Puerto Rico was just not as robust as it was in Texas and Florida. Now, that's partly because Puerto Rico is an island. It's hard to get to all these resources too quickly. But it's also arguably because it's not a state. It doesn't have representation in Congress. And we have a politics and a culture which worries about what's in front of us and what's the immediate concern. And, there weren't lots of cameras in Puerto Rico for very long. It wasn't like Katrina. It wasn't like Texas after Harvey. And the response has kind of shown that. Puerto Rico was a disaster waiting to happen, and then a disaster happened.
So, what would be your opinion on Puerto Rico gaining statehood? Do you think that would help?
Oh, I'm a pro-statehood person. I think they should. There are, part of Puerto Rico's problem is politicians never get their act together, so they've never had a very good vote on it. Albeit they did recently have a vote. But I would, if I were in charge, I would have basically a primary and a general. The primary election would be, current status, statehood, or independence. And then the top two vote winners there, then in November, would vote on what they want. And then we would abide by that vote. That's how I would do it, but I'm not in charge. Politics, it's the art of compromise, and there are a lot of ugly calculations that are made. And Puerto Rico is probably a pretty good example of that. I mean, its current state of neglect is pretty shocking. Like, whether people want to admit it or not, this is America, and it really makes it difficult for us to lecture the Venezuelans and the Cubas of the world on the benefits of our economic system. I mean, don't get me wrong, theirs suck worse. But, we have Puerto Rico, which is kind of a stain on our reputation. Like, these are Americans, this is America, these are American citizens, and it's not being treated like it.
So, you had that little interesting spat with Dan Bongino. Is that how you pronounce it?
Dan Bongino, yeah.
Dan Bongino. I assume you guys aren't friends still?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
I think actually that's probably how I wanted to end it. I just wanted to see if you two had made up, if you guys were on good levels.
But, the reality is Dan and we've had our spats and our disagreements, but he's got his hustle, I've got mine. I'm not sitting around worrying about Dan. I'll have a beer with him if he wants.
Yeah. All right, Mark. Well, listen, I greatly appreciate it.